Moving on, we would like to talk about some of the methods for keeping track of these data and how to accurately, properly record these data in a format that's acceptable to the department. So in doing so, I'm basically going to start quoting almost verbatim the regulations in 18815.9, the methods section, just because it does such a good job, explaining exactly what's required. So folks following along at home can also refer to that regulatory text section in which everything that I'm saying right now will basically be spelled out in the same form or fashion. So in general, and I just wanted to put this sort of first, even though this is the last subsection in 18815.9, this is still sort of a helpful reference, and I apologize, the white border of this is not really coming through very well on my screen. Oh, it looks like it's okay on this screen. But yeah, so some of these some of these cells have been merged together just for kind of ease of viewing. But in general, the left side of the table is the stream, and the right side is what information you will report from that stream. In general, what information should be kept track of when you're handling these kinds of streams. So if you're handling solid waste, and you're sending solid waste, you generally want to be keeping track of the tons, the jurisdiction of origin, the source sector, and the RDRS number and contact information to each facility to whom material was sent. For disaster and designated, as I've alluded to several times, you don't need to track the jurisdiction, just the tons, and the RDRS number for where you either from where you got it or where you're sending it. Green material potential, beneficial reuse material. Again, we talked about why jurisdiction of origin is needed for that and those flows. So you would retain that information basically anytime you're dealing with that material stream, the tons as well, and the RDRS number. Non-green material potential, beneficial reuse, recycling and composting, and broker transporter. You would want to keep track of the tons, the material type, and the RDRS number for which to which you're sending those streams. End user, you generally, as I've alluded to as well, tons, material type, and end user category by region, something that you want to record. And in some cases, you may need to keep this information, but not necessarily report it to the department. So, there's certain things that, again, you would still want to keep track of, even though it's not necessarily a requirement to submit it in that exact format. There are some things that we can ask for more information on. We're not really covering sort of record review requests or the ability for the department to go ahead and look at records, but please keep in mind that that is a possibility. It's outlined in the regs, section point 11 and point 12, I believe, 18815.11 and 12, and you can read that at home if you like, but we're not really going to cover that. But essentially, there are ways in prescribed methods in which you're responsible for tracking these information by stream, and you could be called upon in the context of a record review request to provide additional data about each of these streams is a possibility. So having documentation and reference and being able to accurately keep track of all this is going to definitely pay dividends. if in fact the department does want to follow up with you about some of these flows. And it is a distinct possibility that we may do so at some point, if the situation warrants it. So I want to make sure that that's on folks' mind, that we do have the ability to go ahead and ask some further questions about some aspects of your reporting, if we see potentially anomalous things going on, or in lieu of an audit or an inspection, or not to get too much into that right now, but just wanted to highlight sort of the reason why we're asking for records to be kept in a certain way, and that sort of thing is to potentially expedite or make that a little bit more user friendly for us. All right. Next, we're going to be talking about methods, as I alluded to. So you'll indicate in your quarterly report which methods you utilized from section 18815.9 in relation to determining material type, estimating tonnages, and source sectors for solid waste specifically. There's not a requirement to track source sector for anything but solid waste. Okay, so let's first start talking about material type. As I alluded to previously, material sent to a disposal facility should be characterized as solid waste, with the exception of food waste self-haulers, recycling, composting facilities and operations, and any entity who sends that's a stream of potential beneficial reuse to a disposal facility. You would need to indicate that it was, a certain material type if you're sending it for beneficial reuse. And we talked about how food waste self-haulers don't send the material as solid waste, they send it as food waste. And we talked about how recycling and composting facilities, the instance that I highlighted of the contaminated PET bales, they would report as PET bales sent to a disposal facility if that were indeed the case. All right, so further to that point, reporting materials, you'll want to do so at the level of segregation at the time they were sold or transferred. So that was that whole conversation about wet and dry tons. It's not a question of wet or dry, it's a question of how it was, when it was sent, and how you categorized it when it was sent, meaning when it left your facility and became the possession of someone else. So not necessary to further sort or categorize material beyond that point. You wouldn't need to break open bales or something to find out what more is inside. If it's mixed plastic and you sell it as mixed plastic, that's how you would report it. There's no need to additionally categorize or characterize any material at any point for these regulations. Report grades if that was how it was sold. Report based on applicable industry standards, again, if that's how it was sold or transferred. Report mixed materials as mixed or commingled, again, based on applicable industry standards. If that's how you sold it or transferred it. Report solid waste mixed with other materials as solid waste. So just some general guidelines that we've established in our regulations that sort of articulate more so best practices with respect to material type and how to report that. So generally it's, fairly straightforward. It's, at the level of handling when it was sold. So I'm guessing every single entity who, sends out material knows the state in which, it was sent, or it had to be marketed in some way. And so it's that marketing or, basically commodity or however you want to describe it that you would report as a result of that sale or transfer. So if that makes sense to folks, I'm going to move on and talk a little bit more about material type. Now here with respect to beneficial reuse, if you send material for potential beneficial reuse, ADC or AIC, you would report according to the material types that are listed here. So I'm not going to read every single one, but it is these correspond to the Title 27 alternative daily cover regulations that essentially lay out what kinds of materials that the department considers acceptable, and of course all of these require prior enforcement agency approval. You wouldn't just start using these on a whim. You would need to obtain approval for that first from the enforcement agency. But the Title 27 lays out, some examples of material types. So you would report according to those established material types, either when you applied it or if you knew at the time that it was sent to the disposal facility. Now, with respect to and again, as I mentioned in the flow chart, the flow chart should bear this out. But we had that instance where, we were talking about the disposal facility. They would need to say how on the site they applied that material. So either as alternative daily cover or ADC, alternative intermediate cover or AIC, or as construction or landscaping and erosion control. So they would bin them into those four categories and report the tons that were by material type that were sent to each of those on-site sort of beneficial reuses. Report the beneficial reuse that went to construction and landscaping and erosion control according to the standard rules for reporting material type. So that was the guidance that I provided a couple slides ago. This stuff, you would want to use that in talking about the tons of construction or the tons of landscaping and erosion control beneficial reuse material that you accepted for use at the landfill for beneficial reuse. You're not including tons of clean or contaminated soil used as cover, for instance, daily cover or any other kind of cover or any other kind of use at the disposal facility. So that's analogous to how it's structured in DRS, where you're not including those tons of clean soil or contaminated soil in the solid waste. It wouldn't, because soil is soil, it's not counted as disposal for these purposes here. So let's see if there are any questions with respect to that material type reporting. All right, no one has any questions so far, so I'm going to continue on and talk about jurisdiction of origin. So jurisdiction of origin is the place within which material was generated, and under RDRS, you would only be required to report on jurisdiction of origin for solid waste material handled. A hauler shall provide the jurisdiction of origin to the receiving facility at the time of delivery, unless the hauler and the receiving facility have agreed to periodic reports. The periodic report must be submitted 30 days prior to the due date for that receiving facility. The hauler can use methods such as the following to determine the percentage of solid waste from each jurisdiction. So here's how haulers can determine jurisdiction of origin for the material that they pick up. They can use the actual tons collected from each jurisdiction. They can use a total volume of the bins emptied from each jurisdiction. Using billing records or for customers in each jurisdiction, or dispatcher records of hauling routes and generator locations. So those are ways that haulers can determine the percent composition for the materials that they send on to transfer processors. So for instance, you have several different route trucks that are operating on different routes. That can sort of be reported on periodically, and you can collect the combination of billing records and dispatcher records from the route. You can get a rough sense of the jurisdiction of origin breakdown for the allocation of the waste that you picked up. So we want folks to use those for approved methods, and in order to estimate the jurisdiction of origin and the percent breakdown in terms of jurisdiction for material picked up by hauler and sent to either transfer processor or disposal facility. So for a transfer processor or disposal facility, they have an obligation to determine the jurisdiction of origin for the material that they receive from direct haul. We discussed how when they're getting material from other transfer processors, it's not a requirement to, again, collect the jurisdiction of origin information, because that has been that has already been reported upon in RDRS and will be passed seamlessly from inflow to outflow according to what was already been reported for that transfer processor that you received the material from. So they can determine the jurisdiction for each load of material from the direct haul, meaning everyone except other transfer processors, by asking each person bringing materials at the time of delivery, basically, where are you coming from? Or where was the material generated that you're now bringing to my facility? They can use periodic reports, again, from the entities who deliver them materials. They can also use other methods to capture the information on each load as it arrives. So, like RFID and other technologies, we don't preclude the use of that if that's how you track based on, route trucks or that kind of thing. If a gatehouse, now let's talk about gatehouse attendant and the requirement to ask for jurisdiction of origin versus when you don't have to do it. So if a gatehouse attendant is present for at least 1 week per quarter, they shall collect the jurisdiction on each load for which they are present. And if the gatehouse attendant is not present for at least that duration, the facility shall additionally conduct an origin survey at least once per quarter and for at least 1 week in duration. The facility shall adjust the jurisdiction percentages obtained during the survey weeks to tonnages that have not been assigned a jurisdiction of origin in their reporting period. So essentially, the old DRS laid out some instances where that could be a possibility. I think we try to align some of that with that. And that was kind of what guided our thinking in terms of these facilities that don't necessarily have the gatehouse attendant there. If we want it to be, if the gatehouse, if they're there at least 1 week per quarter, then they probably have more detailed information than what could be ascertained from a survey week. If it's less than 1 week per quarter, they would need to conduct that survey week. And then we also continue on here, and if they don't have a gatehouse attendant for any of the business hours, but you only accept material from specified jurisdictions, you can use you can use some other methods to obtain the jurisdiction of origin for that waste that's received and the gatehouse attendant isn't present. So you can estimate the percentage allocation based on facility usage agreements and restrictions, property records, or other records that would be representative of the jurisdictional breakdown of the material received. If you want to go ahead and allocate it in that way for that kind of facility without the gatehouse attendant present and only accepts material from specified jurisdictions, you have some leeway as far as how you want to go about estimating that, the percent allocation for the jurisdiction of origin. Now, last scenario, don't have a gatehouse attendant ever and have no representative basis for determining anything that goes in there. Essentially like an unstaffed, very rural transfer station that's like a drop-off bins or something like that. They can host assign the jurisdiction of origin. That's sort of the worst case scenario when all other options have been exhausted. So we talked about, having the gatehouse attendant be there. We talked about if they don't, they can use survey week. If they don't, they can use property records. And if all else fails, they can host assign the tonnage. So essentially we lay out, multiple tiers or steps before you get to that point. So we did, it's probably going to only be the case, we hope, that very rural, unstaffed facilities are host assigning the tonnages with respect to solid waste. The other facilities, we probably want to see a little bit more, but it depends on, of course, your business practices already. All right, so in so many words, that's essentially where we're at right now. Last thing about jurisdiction of origin, I think. Again, and we've touched on this in the flow chart, but for jurisdiction of origin for solid waste and green material, potential beneficial reuse sent by a transfer processor also needs those the jurisdiction of origin information when you send it to each receiving reporting entity for those two streams of materials. And the default is to allocate the outbound waste according to the percentage inbound. So in other words, if you received 40% Oakland, 60% Hayward, you would send out by default 40% Oakland, 60% Hayward. But you can amend that and change them around, as we alluded to in the transfer processor allocation slide, based on facility-specific practices such as tracking and sorting individual loads, segregating the flows from jurisdictions, and gathering other relevant information on the composition and recoverability of the materials from each facility or jurisdiction. So for instance, you had a dirty MRF and you sent material, or you accepted material from Hayward and Oakland, but you knew, Hayward's material is dirtier. You can go ahead and say, actually, at the end of the day, 65% was from Hayward and like 35% was from Oakland. So if you have more granular information that sort of touches on the process or recoverability, we were able to pull out more from this jurisdiction and less so from that jurisdiction. You can account for that. And you can also say, for this jurisdiction, we sent 0 to this landfill because, they're precluded from disposing that material in landfill. They're only allowed to use this particular landfill. You can go ahead and move those allocations around based on what actually happened to that waste. If you segregate the waste, again, from certain jurisdiction, only send that along to a certain landfill, there are ways that you can track that and report that in RDRS. Lastly, and I've again alluded to this, recyclers, composters, and broker transporters would host assign the jurisdiction of origin for solid waste and green material potential beneficial reuse sent, meaning there's no obligation to track the jurisdiction of origin for the recyclables as they're sorted out, and then apply that tonnage to, for instance, the residuals, and then say, it was like, again, 50% or 60% Hayward, 40% Oakland. The composter isn't, or recycler isn't obligated to track that. They would just say, and if, for instance, let's say that the composter is located in Martinez, they would say I'm coming from Martinez, and the tonnage that was sent to the disposal facility would be assigned to Martinez, even though the material may have been procured from Hayward or Oakland. We don't have any obligation, and we don't have the authority to track jurisdiction of origin for recyclable materials. So that we're sort of hamstrung in that respect, and a lot of the host assignment for that sort of thing, it came about as a direct implication of that. All right, any questions at this point about jurisdiction of origin?
I have one clarifying question. This is from Stacy Hubbard, and she just wants to be clarified. She understands that she needs to report jurisdiction of origin for solid waste, but she also wants to confirm that it needs to be reported for green waste that may be used for beneficial reuse or beneficial use.
Ma'am, that's correct. Yeah, and I'm sorry if I at some point said it was just solid waste. For jurisdiction of origin information is also required for green material, potential beneficial reuse, and we've talked about the need for that. The reason for that, and it having to do with the green material ADC being counted as disposal come 2020. So if there is material that you think is going to that, and I think this was sort of the conversation between Veronica and John a little bit earlier, kind of delved into this. So I don't want to get too bogged down, but we can certainly follow up if needed. Thank you. All right, let's quickly cover a couple of the last thing, I believe, which is source sector. And so I've talked about source sector defined. It's one of three sources where solid waste is generated. Solid waste, again, we're not requesting this information be provided for anything but solid waste. And it's usually we request it as an aggregate or facility-wide number for the material that is sent or for the material that is disposed. So it comes from these three sources, and we discussed this in the definitions section of the regulations, but essentially the three sources are contract hauled single family residential or residential, contract hauled commercial / multifamily residential or commercial, and self-hauled, so material hauled by a generator. We also prescribe in the regulations that disaster, debris, and designated waste are to be assigned to the self-hauled source sector. So and getting a little bit into the requirements for source sector, they'll transfer processors and disposal facilities will estimate the overall tonnage or percentage from each source sector for disposal by using the following methods. So assigning based on vehicle type or, So small vehicles, assign like automobiles, pickup trucks, and trucks with small trailers. You can go ahead and assign to the self-hauled source sector. Side loaders, meaning, those ones that take automated curbside black bin material. That would be residential, whereas front loader would be for commercial. So that, again, and it's not designed to be a perfect or exhaustive metric. I know that there's some instances where the front loader can pick up the carts and the roll carts and that kind of thing. And so, it's not supposed to be perfect, and we get that, but we just want you to try your best to use an acceptable method. So recognizing that is not necessarily going to be a perfect representation of source sector, we want to essentially collect this material so we can do some more detailed regional or statewide analyses with these numbers. So that's, the point of this exercise is to sort of get it as a facility-wide and both the regional or statewide estimates on source sector for what's being disposed, so we can potentially take some policy action with respect to targeting the different source sectors for additional programs or other kind of things again, you can't manage what you can't measure. We are using this to achieve, evidence-based policy making. So that's essentially the reason for collecting these data. So it's very important that we get that, and we'll be able to aggregate that and produce some good analyses with respect to that. So we appreciate your cooperation immensely for that info. All right, assigning another way you can assign source sector if you're a transfer processor or a disposal facility is to use billing records. So cash accounts you can call self-hauled. Accounts for jurisdictions or haulers for residential routes you can call residential, and then accounts for commercial routes call commercial. You can also request periodic reports from haulers about the source sectors, and you can only request but not require the periodic reports from a hauler with respect to this article. So, take that for what it's worth. Here are some additional methods to estimate source sector. Ask the driver what source sector is coming from. Assign disaster and designate it as self-hauled, so we talked about that already. That's an easy way to take categorize the disaster debris, if that would be helpful. Assigning residual and disposal and materials sent by recyclers, composters, brokers, transporters, and other disposal facilities as self-hauled. So if that would be helpful for purposes of obtaining the source sector, feel free to use that as an acceptable method. Now, if a transfer processor lacks an attendant and is unable to estimate source sector based on one of the methods that we specify here, so any of the 5 methods that we discussed, if they're not able to do that, you can assign all the tonnage to the sector that makes up the bulk of the delivered material, either based on operator observations or site traffic or the observations of the material disposed. So again, we're not looking for perfection. We just want an aggregate so we can do some better analyses with regards to statewide composition studies and the like. Okay, source sector requirements specifically for haulers. Food waste self-hauler, it's right there in the definition. Contract haulers, they shall provide At the time of delivery, the information, unless the hauler and the receiving facility again agreed to periodic reports, must be submitted 30 days prior to the receiving facility reporting deadline. And the hauler can use any of these methods to estimate the source sector. So again, the vehicle type, the billing records, dispatcher records of hauling routes, bin volumes, weights from each source sector, assigning the disaster and designated to self-haul. So at the end of the day, a reporting entity cannot be subject to penalties in our compliance section. Procedure for imposing civil liability is section 18815.10 if they used an approved method in this section. So, please use the approved methods so that we can avoid potential referral to compliance or, would want to follow up in that respect. So just as long as you use an approved method, you should be smooth sailing for the most part and pretty good to go. Any questions specifically about source sector, either from online or in person?
So I have an email from Stacy from Riverside County. I'm going to quickly paraphrase this, but in any kind of flow from transfer stations to the final destination, when does she need to report on the source sector?
Right. So that's in reference to the transfer processor outflow. You would report the percentage of solid waste outflows that were direct hauled versus accepted from other transfer processors, and report the source sector for all direct hauled tons sent. All right. Let's see. What else do we have here? Okay. I think we have one more section on the methods, and then we'll try to close out here. So estimating and reporting tonnages, how do you actually measure the tons? I've said the word tons probably hundreds of times now, but how do you actually record and measure that? Well, ton is, 2,000, it's a short ton, it's 2,000 pounds, but, other than that, how do you record the pounds and tons and all that? Well, if you use certified scales to measure transaction by weight, use that measurement and not an estimate based on volume when you compile and submit reports to the department. If you don't use certified scales, but instead use non-certified scales, use that measurement and not an estimate based on volume. So if you have scales, you need to use them unless you meet, one or more of the following exemptions. And also if there are other regulatory requirements that preclude you from using scales, you would want to follow that guidance as well and take that into consideration. All right, so here are some exemptions to having to use scales to measure your tonnages. First of all, if you record the self-haul by volume, you can use the volume to weight conversion factors if you're a disposal facility or a transfer processor. So, that's like the small vehicles and stuff. You don't have to, there's not suddenly a requirement to scale those with respect to RDRS. You can subtract the total contract hauled tons if you know how many those are from the total tons you disposed, and that will get you a rough estimate of the material that was disposed from self-haul. So that's another way that source sector can be estimated. If a transfer processor is a small volume in the sense that they accept an annual average of less than 100 tons of material per operating day, or less than 200 tons if located in a rural city or county. And a rural city or county is defined in section 40183 and 40184 of the PRC. If you want to know if you're rural or not, then you can use volume to weight conversion factors in lieu of measuring using scales to measure tons. You can also report the tonnages. Report the tonnages that were weighed at the receiving facility. If you can get those as well, you can use those. Okay, if you transfer or sell material other than solid waste based on volume, then you can use material-specific volume to weight and conversion factors. So if you sell compost by the yard and you have a material-specific volume to weight conversion factor, it is not suddenly a requirement that you have to scale all the compost that you sell. If you send material to another reporting entity with a different RDRS number using a conveyance system, you can report estimate tonnages using volume to weight conversion factors, flow rates, or belt scales. And if you're a disposal facility and you don't have access to scales and do not receive more than 4,000 tons per year from contract haulers, excluding disaster debris, you're precluded from needing to use scales to measure tons. Two additional exemptions here. The disposal facility is located in an area prone to inclement weather for 3 months or more out of the year, and which does not allow for the adequate operation and maintenance of scales. So, for instance, entities who are located in the high Sierras and a small volume transfer station, it's not the case that suddenly now you need to purchase scales. If the usage of scales would be prohibitive and wouldn't be adequate, or you don't have, again, looking at the second bullet point, the availability of electric utility to power the scales is prohibitive. If you're in that sort of circumstance, we're not requiring you to purchase scales. So that should help some of those facilities out that don't have too large tonnages from having to fully comply with the provisions. They have an out in that sense. Now, if volume weight to weight conversion factors are indeed utilized, you would need to indicate that in your report. You would need to retain documentation on the basis and usage of those conversion factors, update them every 3 years, and if the department finds them unsatisfactory, you will be required to amend the conversion factors. So it's there if you want to use it, but please don't abuse it in the sense that we can require you to change some of those if they don't correspond to reality. Questions with respect to estimating and measure tonnages? Nothing. So let's talk about, and this will sort of bring us to a wrap up. I know I keep saying that, but I promise this is the end. Now, it's been a lot of confusion about, entities who have complex sites. They got C&D processing, they got composting, they got mixed waste processing, they got maybe even a disposal facility on site, and maybe organics processing, additional organics processing. So we recognize that there are complex sites out there, and we've structured the reporting to reduce a lot of the reporting burden associated with transferred tonnages between entities on a single site. So I'll just briefly kind of go over the ground rules for what you need to do for different flows on a site. So if facility in operation has the same RDRS number and located on the same site, they don't have to record or report the the tonnages between one another. So this would be a case of a transfer station MRF permitted transfer processor taking the lead for a dependent activity that is like a clean recyclable operation. So they wouldn't have to record the tonnages transferred between those entities. Now, if you send separated recyclables or separated organics to another reporting entity with a different RDRS number, but still located on the same site, well, you're not required to report those transferred tonnages. But the person who is responsible for the off-site sale of those materials shall report as appropriate. All right, if you send solid waste or potential beneficial reuse to a transfer processor or disposal facility with a different RDRS number, you shall report these transfers. So in other words, if you have a transfer station, MRF, and a landfill on your site, and it left the back of the transfer station and went to the landfill, you would need to report on that tonnage. That's to account for the solid waste that is being disposed. So we definitely need to know about that. All right. Transfer processors and disposal facilities shall report tons of solid waste generated on-site by dependent recycling and composting activities. So essentially, that's a restatement of if you take the lead for reporting on for one or more dependent activities, it's the lead facility who ultimately reports the total tonnage sent out of all of those ones for which they're reporting as the lead for. So if the transfer processor took the lead for the composting facility that's a dependent activity, they would be responsible for reporting the tons of finished compost. They meaning the transfer processor taking the lead and not the dependent composting activity. So yeah, and the flow chart has sort of bears that out to some extent. For instance, I'm going to jump back a few slides and sort of give a little bit of a running example of that. So if you'll just bear with me, I'm going to back up several times more here and try to illustrate in the last couple of minutes or so what we mean by that. So let's see, let's take an example here. So we got this disposal facility with the complex site is reporting for Ralph's Composting. So if Ralph's Composting produced residuals, meaning, solid waste, they would need to account for that as a direct hauled inflow into the facility, or they would essentially, if they were transfer processor, but if they're recycling facility, they would indicate, basically how many they would record but not report the tonnage transferred from the residuals generated from the composting to the land. This is not a very good example, but yeah, so if you, for instance, if let's say this is a transfer processor and the residuals were produced from the composting facility, you would need to account for that as a direct hauled inflow, actually. That would be combined with the total tons of direct hauled solid waste. So I think we've discussed that in previous workshops, so I don't want to get too bogged down into that, but essentially there are requirements for residuals and needing to account for those at some point in your report, whether that's just recording that information and including that as an aggregate or just keep needing to keep track of that on the site. So to recap our learning objectives, hopefully we've covered our bases here in terms of knowing for each entity type what information you'll need to provide to the department for the flows that you send. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about the acceptable measurement methods for tonnages, source sector, material type, jurisdiction of origin. And you know how to compile and basically put that information that you spent time recording into a format that's acceptable for submission in their quarterly report to the department for RDRS. All right, so thank you so much for tuning in today. Let's go ahead and see maybe if there are any final thoughts or questions from folks, maybe online, if there was something that triggered, blind flashes of the obvious or something like that.
So we're getting a couple of questions pertaining to the nitty-gritty of the system, but I think that some of these questions may be a little more higher level, so hopefully they might be appropriate today. So first question is, lots of people are wondering where can we find the contact information for these entities or for these facilities in RDRS?
Yeah. So I've referred to that as well, and I usually say that in the context of when I say RDRS number and contact information. So if you have you essentially, and this is getting into the reporting system, but you'll start typing, the name of the facility that you're sending it to, and it should autofill, once you reach a certain point, and it'll tell you what the RDRS number is if it's already been registered, and then it'll proceed to automatically enter all the contact information for that because it's already in the system. So to the extent that you're sending flows to RDRS numbers that have already been registered in the system, you don't actually have to provide the contact information because it's already been provided by that entity. The contact information is required for when you're sending it to a facility and that facility is not registered. So that facility will you'll fill in the contact information for the facility. The facility that you report as sending material to may get a ping from the RDRS system saying, hey, material was indicated as being sent to you in RDRS. You may have a reporting obligation as well. You'll want to review, what's going on, or if applicable, you'll need to create a web pass for that entity to which you were described as receiving waste from. So hopefully that helps. And we're hoping that in most cases that the entity's already registered, the RDRS number's already been assigned to them. So, you'll just basically, if it's like Steve's Metal Products, if that's the name of my company, you start typing Steve Metal and it'll autofill the rest of it, and you just hit tab and it's already in the system, so it'll already have the contact information. So the more entities that register, maybe I'll use this as a call to action or shout out. The more entities that we get registered, prior to the start of reporting, the easier it will be for everyone because all the information will already be in the system. So again, it's kind of like paying dividends a bit. The more work we can do here in terms of getting ready, the easier it will be for literally everyone in the system. So great question.
Another question is there can we revise or otherwise amend or correct reported tonnages after the reporting deadline is over?
Great question again, and the answer is yes, you may. However, when you submit your report, you're indicating that the information as submitted is true and correct. under penalty of perjury. So, if there's changes that are needing to be made or whatever, it's going to be within the context of that, if that helps. So it wouldn't, we're trying to avoid what tends to what has happened in DRS, which is where entities basically submit placeholder information and then go ahead and amend it later. That's a total no-no with regard to RDRS. The information needs to basically be correct the first time. If there are some little boo-boos or that kind of thing, we can work that out, and it's not going to be a big deal. But if it's something larger than that, you'll need to go ahead and amend that report, meaning the report you initially submitted, that stays forever as part of the record. If you choose to amend that, you need to open up, basically submit a duplicate report, and then have that old report be superseded. The system will handle a lot of that back-end stuff, but everything you submit and hit the submit button for is final at that point. So a record will be made of it as soon as you hit submit. And if you go back and amend that, we may take a look at some of the differences in the report to see, what's going on here. What was the context within which, these amendments were made? So that's not to say that it's not possible, but, I wouldn't consider that, a standard practice in terms of reporting. But in exceptional circumstances, of course, there's the ability to amend. So thank you.
And then last question about logistics. So will there be any follow-up with RDRS staff in regards to jurisdiction of origin, transfer processor, and/or disposal facility if a disposal facility modifies the data provided by a transfer processor?
Well, maybe I'll let John take a stab at that.
So in the system, a disposal facility will submit information on the jurisdiction of origin for the material that is directly hauled to them. They will just record the tonnage from each of the transfer stations. So the landfill doesn't have an opportunity really to modify the jurisdiction of origin data from each of the transfer stations. So it is whoever accepts the material first as direct haul is the one that assigns the jurisdiction of origin. And then that jurisdiction of origin is passed into the system and applied to that material later down the road. We'll be looking at all the jurisdiction of origin information and seeing if it all makes sense, but I think that particular example isn't going to be an issue.
All right, no other questions? Okay, please go ahead.
So there has been a little bit of interest in regards to water treatment plants. Do you mind giving maybe just a 30-second recap of that again?
Sure. So I mentioned wastewater treatment plants earlier as in the context of recycling and composting facilities and operations, pursuant to the definitions of wastewater treatment plant and also of recycling. It's very well established that they fall under the reporting for recycler composter. So if they produce 100 tons or more of biosolids, which we consider an intermediate product, and then send that material to a composter or to direct land application in excess of 100 tons per quarter combined, they would need to register and report as a recycling and composting facility or operation. So we get that, there are some new requirements for the wastewater sector, and we've tried our best to outreach with that. I've spoken at a wastewater treatment conference in Palm Springs about a month ago and tried to educate folks. And we've tried our best to educate folks in the wastewater sector and of these requirements. And we have worked in close collaboration with CASA, a California Association of Sanitation Agencies, and other partners in with respect to getting the word out for these wastewater treatment plants. And so I'm actually quite pleased with how the registration has gone so far with the wastewater sector. So, but if there are any additional clarifying questions with regards to that, we have a FAQ document that we can send folks about some specific wastewater treatment plant issues. If it's the case where the wastewater treatment plant only produces solid waste, i.e. Biosolids that have not been treated to the acceptable 502 or part 42 part CFR part 502 or whatever federal standards for biosolid land application. If they don't meet those, they don't sell or transfer organic materials off-site, they would actually be exempted from having to register a report. So it's really only those entities that produce large amounts of biosolids and then send them either to direct land application or to composting or but if they simply went to solid waste disposal, that would not be something that is subject to reporting. So there are a couple of nuances and technicalities in there, but happy to clarify for entities who need advice. Just send your questions to rdrs@calrecycle.ca.gov, or you can leave a message at that 916-341-6777 number, and we will try our best to get back to you within a few days at most regarding a preliminary determination. There's also a do I need to register an RDRS tool, and that pertains to wastewater sector as well. So go ahead and take a look at that on our website if you're still unsure. Well, thank you for the question.
And then last question, when do we expect to see examples of completed reports? And I'm assuming next workshop?
Yeah. Next workshop or two will focus on more so the data system itself and how to put data in and submit reports. So, if we'll have something analogous to that, if not that. Great, and thanks to all the staff who participated as well and kept me on time and everything, and big thanks to my manager, John Sitz, for dealing with some of the questions, and thank you all to everyone online and in person who attended today. Hopefully we're all better off because of this, and let's continue the conversation to really continue to make strong strides and move forward and create a better environment for everyone. Thank you.